Welcome back to Unlimited Reads. You're with Chris, and thanks for joining me today as I will be bringing to you a very rare spoiler chat for Salem's Lot by Mr. Stephen King. Now, if you haven't read the book, I would recommend not watching this for obvious reasons. Now, this was a reread for me recently. I had not read this book since I was 15 years old, so a reread was long overdue, particularly since the adaptation has just been released on HBO Max, which I plan on watching very shortly. Now, I have to tell you, I loved this book. It never left my side. I was looking for every available excuse to read it, every opportunity I could get, and King, with this book, was just starting out his career, and with this book he pulled out all the stops and made sure that the reader's enjoyment was guaranteed, especially with a few classic gross out moments that King has been renowned for. Ben Mears, a successful writer who grew up in the town of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine, has returned home after 25 years. Once in town, he meets local high school teacher Matt Burke and strikes up a romantic relationship with Susan Norton, a young college graduate. He starts writing a book about the Marston House, an abandoned mansion where he had a terrifying experience as a child. Mears learns that the Marston House, the former home of Depression-era hitman Hubie Marston, has been purchased by Kurt Barlow, an Austrian immigrant who has arrived in the lot to open an antique store. Barlow is a recluse. Only his familiar Richard Straker is seen in public. Their arrival coincides with the disappearance of a young boy, Ralphie Glick, and the death of his brother Danny, who becomes the town's first vampire, infecting various locals. Ben and Susan are joined by Matt Burke and his doctor Jimmy Cody, along with young Mark Petrie and the local priest Father Callahan, in an effort to fight the spread of the vampires, whose numbers increase as the new vampires infect their own families and others. Susan is captured by Barlow before Mark has a chance to rescue her. Susan becomes a vampire but is eventually staked through the heart by Ben. Father Callahan is eventually caught by Barlow at the Petrie house after Barlow kills Mark's parents. Barlow holds Mark hostage, but Father Callahan has the upper hand, securing Mark's release, agreeing to Barlow's demand that he toss aside his cross and face him on equal terms. Callahan loses, unable to kill Barlow, and ends up fleeing. Ben and Mark succeed in destroying the master vampire Barlow, but are lucky to escape with their lives and are forced to leave the town to the now leaderless vampires. Okay, let's talk about the prologue for a sec because it is worth mentioning here. We first meet Ben and Mark, who are on the run, travelling from town to town, staying in motels, trying to run from an experience they had in the town of Jerusalem's Lot. The radio stations are telling of happenings in the town of Salem's Lot and the surrounding towns. So immediately here, questions are raised straight away on how Ben and Mark got to this point. Now, this is a classic example of how you need to hook the reader at the start of a story, where you draw them in. It's been proven time and time again in fiction where this is a perfect starting point, where we look at characters who have gone through a harrowing experience, we start with an ending scene, and then we go back in time to when the events occurred. So in the thriller genre, for instance, you might have a climactic scene, only a taste of the climactic scene, not the full scene, and then you might go back to 2 weeks earlier, 30 days earlier, 24 hours earlier. So it's a really smart way of foreshadowing the events of the novel, so it entices you to ask these questions. What is going on? What happened to them? And then it's all told and leads right up back to that moment, which is a seamless way of creating tension and drawing the reader in by the shirt collar, just dragging them straight into the story. It is a proven method. Now, if I ever get back on the writing saddle myself, which is another story, I would start a thriller story exactly the same way, with the hook at the end of the book, and then go back in time to however long ago it was and work up to the events back to the climactic scene. It is a really good method on how to draw your reader in. Okay, let's talk about chapter 3, called The Lot 1, and I drew some parallels with Needful Things here. This is the chapter where King introduces the main characters who make up the town of Salem's Lot. So he spaces this over the course of a day, a full working day, where you get to know a few of the characters in a little bit of detail. So he spends a little bit of time with the characters so that it gives you enough of a rapport with them so you can appreciate the experiences they go through later on in the book. Now, I love the way Uncle Stevie writes about small town America's slice of life. There's no one better, guys, because he just gives you a little bit of a taste. He covers everything you need to know about the characters. He plants some seeds and does really good foreshadowing with what is to come of these residents of Salem's Lot. And I found it very similar how he introduces the characters in Needful Things, the residents of Castle Rock. It was very, very similar, and it's a really good way of setting the tone for what is going to happen in a story. Now, in this chapter also, there is a trigger warning here, but everyone who's read the book knows about this one. There is an early chapter scene where Sandy McDougal commits an act of domestic violence against her baby son. Now, when I originally read this as a teenager, I couldn't remember it until I reread this, but it would have I would have processed that a little bit differently as a teenager. Now, as an adult, and more importantly as a parent, when I read that mini chapter scene, I was a little bit mortified. It was very difficult to read. It's amazing how your perception changes over time, especially when you grow up and you become a parent. You process it in a completely different way, and it was very, very uncomfortable, to say the least. And I think I've heard the same thing with Pet Sematary. That's another one I plan on rereading soon, because I haven't read that one since I was young either. I just haven't been game enough to. All I can think about from that book is the crippled sister Zelda hidden in the back room. But I've heard people say how it affects them differently as an adult from when they read it as a young person as well. Another similarity I found was in the character of Straker, who is Barlow's human familiar in charge of his business activities during the day. Now, he was in charge of securing the purchase of the Marston house. He was also in charge of opening up the antique furniture store, and he was very, very charming when he opened up the store. The locals' interest was piqued, and when things ramped up and things came to a head as the tension escalates, funnily enough, he placed a sign on the door saying closed until further notice, which is very similar with what Leland Gaunt does in Needful Things. I found that very, very interesting. Okay, what I'm going to do now is share with you the first of two excerpts I'm going to read, which because I found some of this writing absolutely fantastic, and I just had to share this example with you. This I'm about to read to you comes from the chapter called Ben 4 and is subchapter 8. Now, this is where Susan Norton is having an argument with her mother. They have a very complex relationship, and she does not approve of Susan seeing Ben, because there is another man in Susan's life who tends to get a bit jealous from this. So it was just a really good way of illustrating the tension in their relationship. The rebellion had been growing in her all afternoon, and around 2 o'clock it burst its bonds. They were going at it stupidly, taking the long way around the barn to prove something that was, sorry Mr. Burke, probably a lot of horse shit anyway. Susan decided to go up to the Marston house now this afternoon. She went downstairs and picked up her pocketbook. Anne Norton was baking cookies, and her father was in the living room watching the Packers-Patriots game. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Norton asked. "For a drive." "Supper's at 6. See if you can be back on time." 5 at the latest. She went out and got into her car, which was her proudest possession, not because it was the first one she'd ever owned outright, although it was, but because she had paid for it, almost, she amended. There were 6 payments left from her own work, her own talent. It was a Vega hatchback, now almost 2 years old. She backed it carefully out of the garage and lifted a hand briefly to her mother, who was looking out the kitchen window at her. The break was still between them, not spoken of, not healed. The other quarrels, no matter how bitter, had always knit up in time. Life simply went on, burying the hurts under a bandage of days, not ripped off again until the next quarrel, when all the old grudges and grievances would be brought out and counted up like high-scoring cribbage hands. But this one seemed complete. It had been a total war. The wounds were beyond bandaging. Only amputation remained. She had already packed most of her things, and it felt right. This had been long overdue. So the images depicted there are very, very simple. The language is simple, but the impact is very obvious, where how he illustrated the tension in their stormy relationship that's come to a head. I think he does that very, very well. I also found it interesting that I found a little nugget of a rhyme in the book, and this says, "He thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghosts," which is an aid for managing stutters. Now, that's a really hard passage to say, but it comes very well known in It. If every Stephen King fan will know that. and that's where Bill Denborough utters the rhyme in order to manage his stutter. So it was a nice little nugget there that I found very, very interesting that King uses that in it. It was really cool to spot that little Easter egg. Now let's talk about some vampire lore, which this book is filled with. Now I like how King was very faithful to the original traditional vampire lore. How he depicts the legend of the vampire is very solid, you know, with no reflections, crucifixes, stake through the heart, garlic inviting a vampire in, and the way he describes killing a vampire is very gross, and he is renowned for going for the gross out, and this is going to be my second excerpt example I will read to you because it is just absolutely fantastic. With a mad convulsive yell, he raised the stake over his head and brought it down in a whistling arc. Its razored point sheared through Barlow's shirt, and he felt it strike into the flesh beneath. Barlow screamed. It was an eerie, hurt sound like the howl of a wolf. The force of the stake slamming home drove him back into the coffin on his back. His hands rose out of it, hooked into claws, waving crazily. Ben brought the hammer down onto the top of the stake, and Barlow screamed again. One of his hands, as cold as the grave, seized Ben's left hand, which was locked around the stake. Ben wriggled into the coffin, his knees planted on Barlow's knees. He stared down into the hate and pain-driven face. "Let me go!" Barlow cried. "Here it comes, you bastard," Ben sobbed. "Here it is, leech. Here it is for you." He brought the hammer down again. Blood splashed upward in a cold gush, blinding him momentarily. Barlow's head lashed from side to side on the satin pillow. "Let me go! You dare not! You dare not! You dare not do this!" He brought the hammer down again and again. Blood burst from Barlow's nostrils. His body began to jerk in the coffin like a stabbed fish. The hands clawed at Ben's cheeks, pulling long gouges in his skin. "Let me go!" He brought the hammer down on the stake once more, and the blood that pulsed from Barlow's chest turned black. Then dissolution. In the space of 2 seconds, too fast to ever be believed in the daylight of later years, let slow enough to recur again and again in nightmares with awful stop-motion slowness. The skin yellowed, coarsened, blistered like old sheets of canvas. The eyes faded, filmed white, fell in. The hair went white and fell like drift of feathers. The body inside the dark suit shriveled and retreated. The mouth widened gapingly as the lips drew back, meeting the nose and disappearing in an oral ring of jutting teeth. The fingernails went black and peeled off, and then there were only bones, still dressed with rings, clicking and clenching like castanets. Dust puffed through the fibres of the linen shirt. The bald and wrinkled head became a skull. The pants, with nothing to fill them out, fell away to broomsticks clad in black silk. For a moment, a hideously animated scarecrow wreathed beneath him, and Ben lunged out of the coffin with a strangled cry of horror. I don't need to say anything there about the quality of the writing, do I? The way in which he depicts a vampire being killed is very graphic, very shocking, and I can't imagine me being more scared as a teenager reading that, and I'm completely surprised that I forgot almost everything in this book. Okay, let's talk about Father Callahan briefly here because he does deserve a mention. Now, he isn't a big character in the book. He doesn't have a very long appearance, but he does have an impactful one to me. He's a very sympathetic character. He tries to defeat Barlow, but he fails. Now, he is an alcoholic. He has become disillusioned. He has had a crisis of faith. He tries his best to get the better of Barlow with holding up the crucifix to him, and for a short while, the crucifix glows with power, and it seems like Barlow will be repelled by the cross. However, the glow from the cross just goes out. Barlow snaps the crucifix, and before he gets bitten, Father Callahan retreats and ends up fleeing. And I don't blame him. I mean, facing a vampire like that, it would shake anyone to their core. And he does leave the town of Jerusalem's lot forever. Now, that's not the last we see of Callahan. Stephen King fans know that he does turn up in another certain series where he tends to redeem himself a little bit there. So, look guys, I forgot how awesome this book was. It was a long, long time since I read it, and I'm so glad I picked this up as a reread for spooky season. It was kind of appropriate, but the other reason I wanted to pick it up was because I want to watch the adaptation that has been released on HBO Max. I hear it's very, very good, so I can't wait to watch that. I was looking for every excuse to read it. I couldn't put it down. I loved Stephen King's early writing in this, and I had long sessions of reading this, and managed to get through it very, very quickly. Now, if anyone else is watching this who has read the book, I would encourage you to reach out to me in the comments below. Let's compare notes. What parts of the book did you like the best? Was there anything you didn't like about the book? And have you read the book? How long was it between reads for you? Just share all that with me, and I would be happy to converse back and forth about that. So thank you very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider subscribing. I'm getting closer and closer to the 1,000 subscriber mark, but until the next video, guys, happy reading.